Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad you can be here. My name is Ortiz. I work with WGR Southwest. We are the ones that help to host this, though there are many participants throughout the state that are doing workshops and things. So we're just one of many who are trying to bring some
Just a
free
second.
information. So some free information, hopefully, we're looking forward to it. So to start out, what I'd like to do is introduce our guests, but then kind of give you a little bit of history as to why we're here and what's going on. Because nothing comes in a vacuum. Many times what I tell people is, it's a good thing to know history because you know how we got here, where we came from. So let's take a little bit about how we got here. So our title of our keynote is "What to Expect When You're Inspecting," and we're going to get inspected, and we're going to talk about that. But let's first go into a little history. Our guest today is Lowell Cottle with the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and Rich Muhl also with the Regional Water Quality Control Board. And as I go into history, you'll see how this all works in. So, gentlemen, I want to say thank you for coming, and we'll send it off to you in just a minute as we go through the history. So just real quick, this is a little disclaimer for our thing that this is for informational purposes only. The real authority here is the Clean Water Act ultimately, but your industrial general stormwater permit. So those are things to make sure you reference as part of our discussion in the future. So how do we get here? Well, first off, there was something called the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. It came out in 1948. There had been some pollution, and the Congress at the time was trying to start bringing more environmental awareness. Because after World War II, we had a lot of production, we had a lot of things going on as part of the response to the war, and so people noticed that there was a lot more pollution. So they started something, but a lot of environmental things weren't taking a lot of traction. And so they actually had this control act, and there have been a lot of amendments along the way, but it really didn't have a whole lot of authority or enforceability behind it. So then, as more and more pollutants happened, people became more rare. So there was things that we're about to talk about that culminated in 1969, but there was a lot of things that came before. And let's talk about that a little bit. There was a lot of incidences, and we'll talk about it, but then a really big incident that happened was in California after Santa Barbara. It's called the Santa Barbara oil spill. There was a oil platform off the coast of Santa Barbara where they had a blowout, kind of like they saw with the New Horizons a couple years ago out in the Gulf Coast, and it caused some massive spill. And at the time, it was the largest spill in American history. And now, since then, we've had the Valdez, and they had the New Horizons in the Gulf of Mexico. But until then, it was the largest oil spill at the time, and it got the news, and people saw, you see that sludge and stuff on those beaches, and it was quite dramatic. Then a couple months later, on June 22nd of 1969, in Cleveland, Ohio, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. Okay, and I should say caught on fire again. It had caught on fire quite a few times. In fact, I saw some websites where it talks about 10 times or more. Some say it's 13. There's a debate in the last 100 years since 69. There have been at least 10 plus incidences of the sludge and things floating on the river that would catch fire. And so, in fact, there was a quote where the guy said basically, it's no surprise to no one who worked on the Cuyahoga, an oil slick on the river caught fire the morning of Sunday, January 22nd. So the fact that it caught on fire again surprised anybody. However, the mayor in Cleveland at the time had been looking to try to get the Cuyahoga and bring awareness to the issues. So the next day, he brought the press out to the Cuyahoga River and kind of showed the damage. And actually, the 1969 fire was one of the lesser ones. It only lasted about half an hour, and it burned some bridges and it caused some damage. But it basically, because the press and because the mayor was trying to bring awareness to it, it really helped people to actually open up to say, we had the oil spill in Santa Barbara, and now we're having these fires. What do we do? So here's that Santa Barbara platform, as you can see. I don't know if it's hard to see in this picture, but you can see that oil slick just all over the place. And then you can see what the Cuyahoga River looked like on the left. Now, the left is pictures that they took in '69. As you can see, the guy just reached his hand in the Cuyahoga River, and that's what he came up with. Now, the picture on the right is one of the more famous pictures of the river. The fire that happened in '69 actually didn't have a lot of press or pictures. But what you see when they talk about the Cuyahoga River fire of 1969 is they have pictures from previous fires, which are representative of what happened on the river. Is this actually not from that particular event? So this event happened back in '52, but you can see how literally the river itself is on fire. Or should I say the sludge on the river. So then part of that, because of the Federal Pollution Control Act, it was extensively amended. And in 1972, it became what we now know the Clean Water Act. Okay, so what we have here in California is based off of the Clean Water Act and amendments that actually happened to it later on. The Clean Water Act made it unlawful to discharge any pollutants from a point source. Point source is kind of like pipes or drainages from a known facility. So anything that goes off into the water. They have something called non-point pollution, where basically it's coming from everywhere. You don't where, it's running off into the water from different locations. But point sources where it's coming from pipes or conveyances or things from a known or a relatively known location. And basically, it was trying to keep the waters of the United States clean from pollution, kind of like keep what happened in the Cuyahoga River from happening. Part of the Clean Water Act also established the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES permit program, okay, and the requirements. Now, you're going to hear NPDES programs a lot because basically that's what you're under now. Anybody who's got industrial general stormwater permit coverage knows it's an NPDES permit. Now, you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, we're talking federal. What's going on? We're in California, and my permit says California. Well, let's go there real quick. Okay, so in 1987, there'd been a series of amendments, but in '87 they made quite a few, and part of it was to encourage what they called an EPA state partnership. So now what happened was EPA was trying to get buy-in from the states to facilitate and run the programs. Okay, so it was basically the partnership means that a territory or tribe means receive authorization for one or more of the NPDES program components. On September 22nd, '89. The state of California became authorized to administer the state's general permit program. So they got authorized to actually administer several things. And I have the websites cited below. You're welcome to take a look at those. But basically, they were able to regulate individual, what they refer to as NPDES permits, and also they were authorized to run the general permit. Now, the good thing about the general permit is it's a permit that has general rules. And what you have to do with these general rules, you have to comply. Your facility if your facility requires permit coverage, there's a whole lot I can go into. But the bottom line is, if your facility that requires general permit coverage, okay, you need to comply with those general rules. And what you have is your stormwater pollution prevention plan. The whole point of the plan is not to copy the permit, stick it in the book, and say, look, we have our SWAW. Well, that's I've seen that a lot. What the plan does is says, hey, here's the rules, and here's how we plan to meet with the rules that are in sections 10 and 11 of the general permit. Okay, so California had taken steps for years, and as California is they're often ahead of the curve when it comes to stormwater quality. And so they had taken steps for years. They had created the State Water Resources Control Board. Okay, that's the main body in charge of making sure that our water resources here in California are clean and to help enact that. And then they ratified something, which this is kind of new. It was new to me in my studies. It's something called the Dickey Water Pollution Control Act on October 1st, 1949. And what that did was it created what we have and where these gentlemen come into play, the regional boards. Since California has diverse areas varying in precipitation, topography, and population, recreational activities, and agricultural stuff, basically the Dickey Act created the 9 water boards located in each of the watersheds. Okay, and so the water boards or regional water boards, they're the ones that actually are the enforcement arm. They are responsible for overseeing the enforcing and the state's pollution abatement program and authority ultimately given to them from the federal government. So California received permission in '89 to administer its own NPDES programs. So what we're here is, so when you have general permit coverage, you'll say the state of California issues you a waste discharge elimination system, a WDID number, for discharging water from your property under the requirements of the California Industrial General Stormwater Permit. But the Industrial General Permit has its authority from the federal government. So the regional boards, their job is to make sure that people are following the permit as it's required. They're the ones that do a lot of the legwork that you see. So the 9 water boards, Region 5 is it's interesting because we have 9, but yet Region 5 itself, which is the Central Valley region, has 3 sections. You have the Redding, you have the Central, which is the Sacramento, and then you have the Fresno one. So our guests today, Lowell and Rich, are both from the Central Valley board, the Sacramento region area. And I in my job, I run across their names and run across them from time to time. And it's better to work with them, and I tell my clients, work with them, not against them. So that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Lowell and then Rich. Could you guys introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your background, where you come from, and what you do there at the regional board?
Go ahead, Lowell.
Yeah, hi. So I had 16 years of stormwater consulting prior to coming to the board. Spent a lot of time on construction, Caltrans projects, PG&E projects, and a pretty wide range of other projects. Came to the board 2 years ago, and my primary focus, almost nearly 100% of my time, is spent on industrial. I'm the lead industrial inspector for Region 5 Sacramento area.
Okay, and my name's Rich Muhl. I'm a senior environmental scientist at the Water Board. I've been with the board for over 23 years. I came from a stormwater background. I was a consultant before I started with the board, and prior to that, I was in the lumber and building materials industry. So I've been doing this for a while. I work on industrial construction. I also work on special projects for the board. So I do a lot of industrial inspections. So I've been out there and see a lot of the issues and try and help dischargers solve some of the problems that they're running into, really with the permit or just with their sites. A lot of facilities are not really designed for stormwater. They're older facilities. And so it can be very challenging sometimes to implement the stormwater permit.
Well, so both of you then started off in private industry before you moved into your positions.
Yes.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about from the water board, so when you in your typical day, when you go out to meet with people, what do you look for in terms of what would a facility you choose? What would cause you to choose to look for a facility?
Lowell, do you want to go, or do you want me to?
So what? I'm sorry. The question was.
The question is, how do you choose the facilities you inspect?
Well, we're required by the EPA to inspect 10% of our permitted sites. So we do have to get out there and inspect quite a few of them. What we look for, one of the other requirements that we kind of go by is that we have to do a certain percentage in economically disadvantaged communities. So it turns out that a lot of our sites in the Central Valley happen to be in those communities. Other than that, we look for industries that are going to be a higher threat to water quality. There's some, like, for example, a pallet manufacturer may not necessarily be a high threat to water quality, whereas an auto dismantler or a recycler, a metals facility, is something that may be a little bit higher up on our radar. We also receive a lot of complaints that we end up following up on. And then there's also, we get contacted by a lot of dischargers that have questions for us, which opens up a whole line of questioning or ends up being inspections. So that's part of how we go about choosing our inspections.
And just to add to what Lowell said, I think too, over the years, we've inspected a lot of sites. One of the things we do when we identify problems on a site, we're very, very likely to go back and do a follow-up inspection at some point. Not right away, maybe, but we do follow-up inspections. So once we've identified a problem, we're going to keep doing inspections till the problem goes away. That being said, we're going to give time for the discharger to solve their issues. We've been working with some sites for, 5, 6, 7 years as they try and work their way into compliance. And as I said earlier, some of these facilities are just not really designed for stormwater. They were a different type of business before this particular facility moved in, and it can be super challenging. So we're aware of that. Both Lowell and I have done a lot of inspections, so we kind of know, where the problems are when we first look and the challenges to bring the site into compliance too. So we're aware of that. And so one of the things we want to do is try and help dischargers identify some of the issues if they don't understand them all, but also identify potentially ways that may be efficient to solve their problem.
Yeah, some of the other ways that we end up doing inspections, we've been looking at sites that have not been submitting stormwater samples.
Yeah.
We have some facilities that have been in the stormwater program for 6 or 7 years and have not submitted a single sample. Sometimes though, when we get out on site, we find that the site doesn't discharge. So the other thing is what we're finding, what I've been finding a lot of recently is some facilities, and I understand from their standpoint it's confusing, some facilities are uploading analytical lab results in a PDF and not actually manually entering them in an ad hoc monitoring report. So our system doesn't flag it. They can't, our system's not designed to go through a PDF with an analytical lab result. They have to manually enter those results in smarts for us to understand and know whether or not they're going to be in level 1 or level 2 if they have exceedances. So that's been another problem that we're trying to work through.
Yeah, Lowell just mentioned that's a major issue we're trying to get resolved, because one of the things we do when we do inspections is we want to have a level playing field. It's not fair for one facility to install BMPs and do the right thing and then have another similar type of facility down the street not do that. So we try and level the playing field, but not submitting results kind of fits into that too. I know not everybody's doing it on purpose, but irregardless, it isn't, so we're trying to correct that issue.
Well, purpose or not, they need to know what the requirements are. So sometimes an inspection is a wake-up call that people use. That's why I know, Rich, that there was a client of mine now where you inspected them and they were fairly new to that area. They had no clue what they were doing, none. And so they came in and I came in to help them, and they really worked hard to get up to where they need to be. It wasn't their intention to beat the law or discourage it. They just really were clueless as it was required. Now, one thing I'd like to mention, since you guys brought it up and it's excellent, is some people say, well, how come Joe Blow down the street is not in the general permit and I am? What people don't understand is the Clean Water Act, which goes down to the, again, this comes from the Clean Water Act first, comes down to our permit, is you have the Standard Industrial Classification Code, SIC codes. And these SIC codes, these 4-digit codes, describe industrial activities that businesses do. So not every business is considered a high threat for stormwater. And so therefore, they're not listed as needing general permit coverage. So for example, if I'm a school and I'm teaching kids, there's very, very low chance of me causing a lot of pollution in stormwater. So if I'm a school, I don't have to get general permit coverage because I'm a school. Whereas other facilities, because of their standard industrial classification, they need to have permit coverage. And so it only comes down to the categories that you have, and you have things, what they refer to, the federal version. I noticed that our general permit is based on the permit from the federal government. The federal government's permit is called, again, you guys know this, but this is for our participating audience, is the multi-sector permit, where sectors are landfills, manufacturing, transportation, these different sectors, business sectors. And these different sectors, they are listed, their 4-digit numbers, their SIC codes are listed. And if in our permit, which carries through from the multi-sector permit, if your number's listed in there, you can't just let water leave. That's one of the things I try to talk about in my opening, is there's people think if your SIC code and you require permit coverage and you're letting water go, you're actually in violation of the permit, because you have to have those controls in place to protect stormwater from leaving. Leaving, it needs to leave relatively clean. And so that's one of the reasons why people are pulled into the permit in the first place. And then now we're talking about things you flag. So do you guys have any kind of stories of things you run across, and I like, you don't have to name names, of course, but maybe stories of places you've gone there that they were completely clueless?
So a couple,
and then maybe some later on that where they were just belligerent and they don't care.
So a couple things. First of all, with schools, you're right, they don't have an SIC code, but school bus facilities do. So school bus facilities are regulated. So, but just the bus facility, because it's considered transportation.
Right.
And one of the other things I want to just mention, the SIC codes are really old. They're really old, and there's some industries that are now in existence that weren't even around when they made the SIC codes. So that's the other issue that we have sometimes with SIC codes. They don't even cover the type of industry that's now operating. So just a couple different things. But we inspect a number of facilities where they don't really understand the permit requirements. So a good percentage of our inspection is explaining the permit requirements, explaining where they have to sample, suggesting places maybe to sample if they don't understand it, and kind of walking them through what the permit requirements are, what they need to do, the whole step-by-step thing. So a lot of on a given inspection, if I'm there an hour, typically, if they're not in level 1 or level 2, and they don't have a QUISP on board to help them, then we're typically going to be spending, I spend a good 20-30 minutes probably explaining the permit and talking about requirements and other things, and answering questions. And so that's one of our jobs when we're out in the field, is to help people kind of understand the permit, because it's not easy. And it can be really confusing, particularly for a business owner that's probably good at running their business, but knows nothing about stormwater. So that's kind of my take. Lowell, go ahead.
Yeah, it can be confusing for a discharger. And, as Rich said, a lot of what we're doing out there is helping people understand the permit conditions. I did recently have a site that I had to issue an NOV for. They were, again, this was part of the confusion. First of all, people that aren't hiring a stormwater consultant and try and do this on their own are typically the dischargers that are getting into a little bit of trouble because they don't really understand the permit requirements and what's involved with it. So after we do an inspection, of course, they do end up hiring a consultant. This one facility that I had down in Stockton had been uploading analytical lab results in PDFs, and they never entered an ad hoc, never entered their results manually in SMARTS. So it turns out they were in level 2 for several constituents and level 1 for another constituent, going back quite a few years. In addition to that, the site was just kind of a mess. So they ended up hiring a consultant, cleaned up their site. I remanded all their annual reports so they could go back and created ad hoc reports so they could actually enter that data into SMARTS. But again, as Rich was saying earlier, it's a big issue, and it's really confusing for a lot of dischargers about the ad hoc versus just submitting analytical lab results as a PDF. And we are really trying to, I did send out a mass email about that to all of Region 5, including Reading and Fresno.
Remember that.
A lot of luck with that. Another issue with that is that a lot of dischargers don't keep their contact information current. So we're not always able to be able to reach everybody.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I have a client out of Stockton, and they were helped by a quiz before, but that's another thing. But first off, I had a thought came to my mind. Can you guys describe me your role as opposed to the role of you mentioned a quiz, qualified industrial stormwater practitioner. What's the role of a QISP as opposed to what you guys do?
So the advantage in a QISP is, the facility's gotten somehow to level 1 or level 2 typically. So they've had some exceedances, they've had some issues. We potentially could have done an inspection and basically, or not, but we could have done an inspection, said, here's your issues, here's some problems. And then they're going to hire that QISP. It's another set of eyes. It's always good to have a third party looking at your facility. We can't dictate means and methods. We can't tell you exactly how to solve the problem. We can sometimes say you could do this, 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 or this. Here's some options that we typically see on these type of sites. If it's concrete batch plant, here's what typically concrete batch plants do, but we can't specifically say install this. The QISP is going to go through the paperwork. They're going to go through your SWEP. They're going to go through the whole thing. They're the ones that can basically say, here's what you need to do to get out of trouble. Here's how you need to get back to baseline. And our goal when we're doing inspections of anybody that's in level 1 or level 2 is to get them back to baseline. We're always trying to figure out when we do that inspection, are they doing what they need to do to get back to baseline? How do we provide extra support for them to get them back to baseline? Because we don't really want to see people in level 1 or level 2 if we don't have to. Now, some facilities are they're in level 2, they're going to stay in level 2 for whatever reason, they're just not coming out. That's okay. We're aware of that. But still, the goal is to get back down there to baseline, solve the issues. In the end, it's really about water quality. That's why we're out doing inspections. That's really the bottom line. So we're going to do what we need to do to protect water quality. And that in the end, if folks just keep thinking that, I think it's really helpful because that's what the whole program's about.
So, Rich, I know you've been around for a little bit, and you were around when they switched from the old 1987 permit to the one that came out in 2015, which the one we have today is very, very close to that from 2015. Perhaps you can give us a little insight into the rationale why they created the QISP position, because I know it didn't exist before the 2015 permit was ratified.
So we had a lot of issues with what we were just talking about. We had a lot of issues with facilities that just didn't understand the program, didn't really know what was out there, what BMPs were available. And when you have a QISP, you have someone that really understands the stormwater program. They understand the best manager practices. They understand the options for best manager practices. And there's also cost that they can provide you with cost-effective BMPs to solve your problem, because there's a lot of ways to do things. And sometimes we see facilities spending a lot of money and time for something that may not work when they could have used something that was really simple and it would have made the problem go away. So that's where the QISP is really valuable. They're basically very educated on the stormwater program. They're able to solve the problem super quickly. And that's why we really try and support QISPs. If I do an inspection of a facility and I'll look for the QISP, and sometimes, or most of the time, I'll CC them on my inspection sometimes to get them back involved in the actual facility. Because again, our goal is to bring that site into compliance as quick as we can.
Yeah, that's a good point about having a QISP on staff. There was a compost mixing facility that I inspected last year, and they had an engineer on staff, and they ended up spending a tremendous amount of money on a treatment system at their final discharge location. And when I got there, the first thing I thought of was source control. They had about 20 to 25 large stockpiles outside, and they were trying to treat all that runoff instead of just putting all that stuff under cover. They wouldn't have had those issues to begin with. So again, having a QISP for someone that's knowledgeable, I think, that in that particular case, that facility could have saved a lot of money, not spending it on an active treatment system and just gone to source control. So yeah, there's a lot of advantages to having a QISP, and especially with writing the SWIP. We see people that attempt to do that on their own, that fall short quite a bit. And once we go through their paperwork, we go through their SWIP to go through the checklist to make sure that they have all the required elements. Then they end up rewriting the SWIP. And having a QUISP on staff ahead of time would certainly alleviate a lot of those issues that we find.
I've come to sites where I say, I need to see, they asked me to help them out. And I said, let me see your SWIP. And they had me a 4-page document.
Yeah.
And I go, okay, let's talk.
Yeah.
And then I've seen some SWIPs where I'm sitting there going, these people made it way too complicated, where the people who actually have their program don't understand it because they put it in, I call it consultantese, And that's my problem being in stormwater since 2007. Sometimes I talk Clean Water Act and stormwater permit instead of talking English. And so I feel my job as a QUISP is to translate from regulatory language to everyday understanding language so that they get the understanding of what they're talking about. And when people say, well, you come from a put source discharge or discrete conveyance, and they're sitting there going, what? So that I had to explain what they mean by that.
Well, and I think too, we have a whole stormwater language that's been developed. We use all ththese acronyms and everything else. And when you're doing an inspection, it confuses people within about 5 minutes. And they're asking you, what does that mean? What does this mean? What does that mean? So, the whole world of stormwater can get confusing really quickly to a discharger. And that's why I think having a third party QUISP or anybody else on site just to look at the BMPs, to look at the operation is really helpful. And so that's kind of my take on it.
Now, Lowell, you mentioned something earlier about how people were submitting the PDFs, but I noticed you're right. When it comes to SMARTS, it's the Stormwater Multi-Application Report and Tracking System, the website that we do reporting on, SMARTS. I noticed I have a client in Stockton where, and I don't understand why a former QISP, I never talked about anybody, but a former QISP, he did a level 1 for them. And then he submitted it with, he had submitted 2 ad hocs, and then he also submitted the level 1 with the 2 ad hocs. And so they thought that their level 1 had been submitted. And then they come out years later, you guys never submitted level 1. They go, yeah, we did. It was like our quiz years ago. We certified it. They didn't realize they were certifying an ad hoc with the level 1 instead of going through the level 1 certification process. And so that ended up pulling them into a level 2, and then they had to do a bunch of stuff. And now they're getting back in compliance. But I have noticed that there are a few QISPs that sometimes miss on SMARTS as well. So I'm glad that SMARTS is trying to become a little more user-friendly now. That's a good thing. But apparently it was confusing even for people with my credentials.
No, yeah, SMARTS is not that smart. I mean, it's just a nice way to put it. It's a very difficult database to use if you don't use it all the time. And so very difficult for dischargers to enter information. But you are right. They are working to kind of make it more user-friendly. Probably going to be a while, but it is getting better. The advantage is, at least in SMARTS, everything is kept in one database. All the industrial, all the construction, all the municipal, it's all kept in one database. So that's helpful, as opposed to some other programs where it's kept in different databases. So that is the good thing, but it should be more user-friendly. And I know the state board's working on that.
I will say this. It is a publicly accessible information. So if you're a facility, which I'm sure nobody watching us is, but if you're a facility that wants to skirt by and not necessarily follow the rules, whatever is up on there, everybody can see it, and including people who would like to make sure that you're following the rules. And so anybody, third parties or such non-organizations, they can see your information. And if you're not diligent about making sure you're doing things right, it can open you up to some issues. Just want to bring that out. So let's get to where the rubber meets the road. When you come out to a facility to do an inspection, what do you look for exactly when you're there?
Lowell, do you want to go or you...
Sure. Well, it depends on, what prompted the inspection. But there's some general things that we look for, and it depends on the type of facility. A concrete batch plant We may be looking for different sources of pollution. Basically, we want to make sure that they have BMPs in place, that their sampling locations are representative. A lot of times we see people sampling parking lots, which we consider a non-industrial area, or they're sampling upstream where it's an inline drain system, and really they don't need to be sampling that. They need to be sampling the final outfall. A lot of times when you get on site, you'll find things that you never expected to find. So that kind of opens things up to a whole, line of your investigation during your site visit. I had a marine terminal that was shipping grain, and they were in level 2 for copper, and I thought that was kind of strange. But when I got on site, I found 10,000 tons of copper ore on site. So yeah, they were actually discharging copper. It was spilling out of their containment. They were loading it into open trucks and driving through the facility across 2 or 3 drainages. So you never know what you're going to find on site. So that kind of will redirect your focus when we're out there. But looking for any sources of open pollution, sediment, or whether it's, anything that particular facility may be discharging, something that we could do with source control, and making sure that their BMPs are correct. We have a lot of auto dismantlers that may have sediment control BMPs, but that's not really going to do them a lot of good when their site is completely impervious. And what we're looking for is for them to filter out oil and grease and metals. So again, like Rich was saying earlier, it's a matter of educating them. So what I'll do in my inspection reports is I'll send them photos of what we consider appropriate BMPs for that particular facility, depending on what they're doing. So yeah, there's a lot of things that don't always go as expected, and your inspection kind of goes a different direction depending on what you find out there.
And I'd just like to add that I think we've inspected a lot of different facilities and different types of facilities. So if it's a concrete batch plant, auto dismantler, we know what to look for. We know what BMPs are typically used. We know what BMPs are effective. So we're going to know that coming in. Tracking is a big issue for some facilities. Sometimes we're looking for that. There's certain things we look for. So we've sort of been around the block before, so to speak. And so we come in and we kind of know what the standard is for that type of industry. And that's one of the things we're looking at too. And so when we do our inspections.
Well, real quick, we're using the word a lot, BMP. I know I define it as anything you do or anything you build to reduce or eliminate pollutants in stormwater. So it's a very broad term. So basically, if you're practicing something where you're fueling up and your design is to fuel undercover or fuel with a drop pan, or you're carefully turning, or there has to be someone on site where you're fueling, those are all practices, those are BMPs. Or if you put some sort of wattles or you put some sort of filtration socks or something, those are physical BMPs. They're all BMPs. So when we use the term BMP, it's anything you do or anything you build to help reduce or at least eliminate pollutants in stormwater.
Yeah.
And it's very broad. And you have structural ones, you have ponds, you have vegetative swells, all types of things.
And you have the non-structural BMPs, which sometimes can be more effective, sweeping, housekeeping, those kind of things. You want to remember those because those are really key to keeping the pollutants off the site, particularly before a rain event. And, you can have a structural BMP, but if you don't keep the area clean, then, you're going to load that up and you're going to potentially have problems. So the non-structural BMPs are pretty important, just housekeeping and things like that. That's one of the other things we look at when we're doing an inspection. If we start the inspection and they have really poor housekeeping, we're pretty sure we're going to be there a while because they'll have other issues associated. And so it's always good to have a nice clean site just from a stormwater standpoint, but also just, it kind of keys us in that we need to look at pretty much everything on site as much as we can. And it almost always, the inspection will go longer if there's poor housekeeping.
Yeah, I tell people if it's not on the ground, it's not going to get in your stormwater. If you can keep it away from the stormwater, if you can keep it from getting down in the first place, it won't be there. When you mentioned Lowell, when you mentioned those piles of copper, I'm sitting there thinking all the bells go off in my head. The numeric action level, that's where I like to go next. The numeric action level, or the target that triggers people to have to do a response, is for copper 0.0332 milligrams per liter or parts per million. That's pretty low. If you have open copper ore and driving back and forth with open copper, you're not going to get close to passing that.
Yeah, they ended up removing all of that copper ore from the facility completely. They thought they could make some extra money shipping that overseas, but turns out it ended up being an expensive cleanup for them. So,
wow.
yeah.
Also curious, when you guys go on site, if you see activities, not necessarily specialized activities like that, but ongoing activities, do you look at their stormwater pollution prevention plan? Because according to the general permit, you're supposed to, besides you have 3 basic things that everybody has to look for, you also have to look for things that your SIC code establishes, but you're also supposed to look for any activities on site that might have a need to look for those in the stormwater. Have you guys often found that when you go to a site, people are doing activities that aren't really reflected in their sampling program?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes the SWIP was written, a few years ago. It's maybe 5 or 6 years old, and they have a different activity that they're conducting that's not covered in the SWIP. So at that point, we would just have them update the SWIP and make sure that, they have the proper BMPs in place if there's any stormwater exposure to what they're doing to that industrial activity.
Yeah, like Lowell just mentioned, a lot of times the SWIPs aren't up to date. They added a different section or have a different process or something else, and it's not reflected in the SWIP. So the SWIP needs to be kept up to date. But also, as we mentioned earlier, the point of contact needs to be kept up to date. That's been an issue. We end up, pretty much we're sending these reports electronically most of the time over when we get them, unless there's a enforcement. So we're sending them electronically. And if we don't have a good point of contact, then we've got to track it down. So important to keep the smarts updated with the responsible person too. So
absolutely, I agree. Okay. Oh, I lost my feed there.
Yeah, so going back to the SWIP, Aaron, what you were talking about earlier, you had mentioned that, a lot of times, we get a 4-page SWIP and you're kind of, scratching your head. And sometimes they're overly complicated. Sometimes we'll get a 200 or 300 page SWIP where they're just putting a lot of fluff in there. So what I've been trying to do is I'm actually sending dischargers what I like to see in a SWIP it's concise, straight to the point, but covers all the required elements. So I've been sending them actually copies of SWIPs. Since they're public record, I'll take the discharger's name off there, but send that to them and say, feel free to use this as a template for your SWIP. If they don't have a stormwater consultant, some of these businesses are small, mom and pop operations. They can't really afford to hire a consultant. So I'll try and work with them a little bit more to help them come up with a SWIP that's acceptable and help them make sure that they're covering all their bases as far as requirements.
Well, that's excellent. We speaking of sampling, that's a key component of our general permit. Can you guys give me your take on why it is that they have to do sampling in the first place, other than the fact that it's required by the permit? But what's the whole thinking behind having to grab stormwater samples?
Well, so just in general, I mean, Lowell, I'll just start with a general comment and you can fill it in if it's okay. And so in general, you're not going to know how effective your BMPs are unless you're sampling, right? You're not going to know. You install stuff, it looks nice, fine, but that doesn't really mean it's going to be effective. And so you need to verify that somehow. And I think that was the original thought in sampling was, well, it's analytical and it shows that you actually the best management practices that you're using are effective. and what you're doing on site, doesn't exceed those numeric action levels. So that's kind of my take on it, but Lowell, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you covered it. I mean, there's no way that we can know if the facility is actually discharging any pollutants other than them collecting stormwater samples to see what's going on at the site and to see whether or not their BMPs are effective. So I think it's a key component of the whole program is understanding what the facility is discharging, whether it's clean, whether there may be additional pollutants that we're not seeing, that non-visible pollutants that we may not understand. So yeah, it's a pretty key component of the whole program.
And I think another key point is that, not everybody samples correctly. And we run into people that just don't sample right. And we have a number of facilities that are in level 1, particularly, they get to level 1 because they didn't even sample right. They're sampling wrong for pH. They're sampling with, they're putting in another bottle and then transferring it to, there's all kinds of stuff going on with sampling. So knowing how to sample is really important. And when you have a mom and a pop that don't understand anything and they just get a cooler from let's say a consultant, basically, and they say, okay, take your samples. They don't even understand how to sample. They're trying to sample sheet flow off a parking lot, things like that. It's really difficult. And so you have to do it right. And we find that a lot of facilities have issues, not really on site as much as just issues with sampling, knowing how to sample. And so sampling is a big component of the program, but it's also one of those things that a lot of people don't do right, or at least get confused on and those kind of things.
It's for that very reason I created that third workshop, which I'm doing tomorrow, where basically it's the how-to of sampling. In fact, WGR, we helped the water board create a how-to sampling video for QUISPs, people with my thing, but I found the information so available for everybody, I've actually made it part of my training for the general public because it's really good. I've seen a lot of problems. An example real quick, years and years ago, I had a client, they were under the transportation SIC codes. They're out now because they no longer have their own fleet and doing mechanical everything, so they were able to get out of the general permit. But while they were in, they had a series of ponds, and the very last pond would discharge to the MS4, to the storm drains that belong to the city. They grabbed a sample one time, and their numbers had always been great because they had literally a pond that would go to another pond that would go to a third pond, so their water was always really in great shape. But then I come back and I see the pH is high, and I see that their solids were high. And I'm like, so I got a hold of them. This is years ago. I'm like, guys, what's going on? There's a trend here. What happened? Well, come to find out, they had to grab samples. And so one of the guys just put on his muck boots, walks out in the middle of the pond, dredges up all this stuff off the ground, and he grabbed a sample, and they had put like this little platform, and it had concrete footings on it that went into the water, into the pond. So he grabs a sample right next to freshly poured concrete footings, grabbing a sample. And so when he got back, the solids were high and the pH was above the 9.0 limit. And I was like, well, I can tell you right now, your problem wasn't water quality. Your problem was protocol, your sampling protocol. So basically, and they grabbed a sample from the wrong side of the pond because they grabbed a sample on this side of the pond and water left from the other side of the pond. So I told them, guys, here, just get yourself an extension boom, grab a sample from the water leaving the pond, not the water coming into the pond or even sitting on the side, but water leaving the pond. And they grabbed samples from the other side, and their numbers went back to what they had always been. And it was purely because of sampling protocol that they had those issues.
Yeah, sampling is a big problem. I mean, it just is in general.
So let's move on to NALs, numeric action levels. What are they? And yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, we've got a few questions in the chat.
That'd be great. Rebecca, can you give us those questions? We'd like to respond to those.
Absolutely. So our first question is there any talk about updating, adding, reevaluating SIC codes?
Ooh, good question.
So yeah, that I'm not aware of any. That's the federal government, and the SIC code manual that we're going off of is from 1987, and that's currently what we're using right now. I don't know,
Right.
Rich, have you heard anything?
Yeah, there is some talk about switching to, I forget, now I'm going to blank on the name of it. It's
NAISC,
NAI, yeah, which
something like that.
is like an SIC code, but a bit more updated. But that will probably be in the new industrial permit if it happens. And that's a ways off at this point. But there is some talk of switching, and it's a valid point because, as I mentioned earlier, some of those SIC codes just don't fit now. So it does make sense.
Well, also I noticed the Clean Water Act and also the general permit gives you guys permission to come onto a site, and if these people are having activities that are threatening stormwater quality, you can force them into a specific entities permit or into the general permit. I mean, I believe is that correct? That your authority, you can do that if necessary?
Yeah, yes, but typically we're going to try and get people into a general permit because it's easier to function for them. It's less specific, less requirements, less paperwork. It's just easier to implement. So we're going to try and we would try to get them to get coverage under an SIC code, whatever SIC code's applicable.
Right. Because I have some clients who got out of the general permit because they're part of the transportation and they no longer have a fleet. But I told them, guys, just because you don't have a fleet, you don't have transportation, you still got to be clean, because the water board can come back and say, you guys are a threat to stormwater. You guys need to get back to the permit. So people, even though they're not in the permit, doesn't necessarily mean they can't be pulled into it if they're bad players.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. Yes.
Yeah, with the transportation SIC codes, they can be exempt from the permit if they're
Right.
not conducting washing, maintenance, and fueling on site. Those three things.
Right. And that's how I got them out. But my client that does that, they actually were very responsible. They actually had us craft a BNP plan based on the EPA's template, and they're following that. It's very close to what we do with the SWEPs. And they've been keeping things clean. They've been tracking stuff. So they want to basically stay responsible. That way they don't get in trouble. I think it's smart on their part. So Rebecca, we have another question?
Yes, we have 3 more. So
Excellent.
besides the IGP, what is a good resource to learn about different BMPs for industrial SWIPs?
CASQA, the CASQA handbook is always good. That's where I would go. It's a comprehensive handbook that's updated on a regular basis. I think it's helpful for any region. I think it's helpful for any state or anywhere. The BMPs are really, it's a great organization, and the BMPs are updated consistently. It's so that's where I would go first.
Yeah, Caltrans also has pretty good standards, as well as PG&E, but CASQA is probably the one that we fall back on the most. It's probably the most widely accepted in stormwater.
Awesome. And the next question, could you share your SWIP sample that has everything you look for, or a summary of what you look for in the SWIPs to us?
Yeah, absolutely. I can email a couple of SWIPs that I send out to dischargers to you guys, and you can email it on to some of the participants who request that.
Again, it's public information, so.
Yeah. This
But
one might be helpful to some people because, you know, the ones that I send out as an example are particularly things that I like to look for.
And, you know, Lowell's effort here, I think, is to help dischargers, and that's really our goal. We're there working with you to try and get to protect water quality. So we're going to help a facility come into compliance as much as we possibly can. Some people need a bit more of a nudge, so we may issue enforcement or whatever just to get them to pay attention to what we're talking about. But basically that's our goal, really, is to help sort of the facility kind of come into compliance. So
you view yourselves as more of trying to come alongside and be more of a partnership, initially at least, to help get them into compliance. Yeah, as much as we can. I mean, some people just don't care, and then at that point, it's our job to kind of figure out how to make them care, if that makes any sense, you know. But we're good at that, and we can do that. But that's not really where we want to go. We'd rather just have people comply, work with them, solve the problem, and move on to the next site, because we have a lot of facilities to inspect.
but you know, we'll focus on the ones we need to bring them into compliance.
Awesome. And the final question is a bit of a scenario. So this anonymous question says, I have a question about permit compliance. Let's say a facility has been in level 2 for a few years now. This facility doesn't generate a lot of money. They are trying to lower their iron levels below the NAL. They have implemented all the minimum required BMPs, good housekeeping training, and etc. And they have tried to cover as much of the outdoor material as they can, but their levels are not improving. Does this mean that they are still out of compliance with the permit because of their NAL exceedance, even though they are implementing their BMPs and doing what they can with the resources that they have? Or are there general compliance options they can consider?
Good question.
Well, I had a facility that I inspected last year that falls into that exact scenario. They were in level 2, are still in level 2 for iron. And one of the issues that we might see there is that it's background. And they may never get out of level 2. So what we have them do at that point is just when they're in level 2, there's a couple of additional questions that come up on the annual report, and all they have to do is just make a statement saying that they that nothing's changed at the facility. Some places, like this particular facility, went to a lot of effort to test for iron to demonstrate that it was background. And even though they did demonstrate it was background, they're still getting those hits in their sample results, which is going to keep them in level 2. So again, all they do every year when they submit their annual reports is just make that statement in their annual report.
Yeah, we have a number of facilities that are just going to remain in level 2. They just, for whatever reason, can't get out of level 2. They're going to stay there. It's okay. It's okay with us. But what it does do is open you up to potential third-party lawsuits. So it's unfortunate, but it does. And so but there's some that they've implemented, just like Lowell said, you know, it's a good example. They've done everything they can. Doesn't really matter. They're going to stay at level 2. So there's just some facilities particularly for iron. Aluminum's another one we run into where just, you know, they're just going to stay there, and there's nothing really, there's no magic bullet that's going to get them out of trouble.
I refer those as stale level 1s and stale level 2s, in that, especially if you have I have a client who builds a pond and it's an 80th percentile 24-hour pond or larger, they don't discharge much anymore. So they may be at level 2 because they've never had a chance to sample again to determine whether their numbers are where they like them to be. So to me, that's not a problem. That's not a red flag. It's a level 2 that kind of proves your compliance. Because why aren't you grabbing samples? Like you guys said, hey, they're not grabbing samples. Go there and you find they have a big old beautiful pond. It's got plant uptake. It's got things going. Okay, well, that explains it. I just tell my client, make sure you put that in your report. Make sure you put that in your SWAT. That way people can see, why aren't you grabbing samples? Well, because we have a massive pond. Now, I may not reach a NONA, which is the notice of non-applicability requirement, but it still, you know, limits what you discharge out.
And having a pond is a great BMP. I mean, it really is. It attenuates the smaller flows. You're not going to have a discharge every rain event. The most you might sample once, maybe twice a year if we get a huge rain event. I mean, that's perfect. That's good stormwater management, in my opinion. But you are right. Then if you're already in level 2, you have to have those samples without any exceedance, and you can't sample because you got the pond. So it can go both ways, but it's still a great BMP. It's still worth installing, and we like to see them, particularly in areas where it's a little bit drier, sandier soil, perks a little better. They work really well.
Yeah, getting back to the question, we understand different scenarios, like what Aaron and Rich were just talking about with a pond, or if it was background, as the example that I gave. So you're not going to get in more trouble. We're not going to be pursuing enforcement actions against you. We do understand that there's circumstances at certain facilities that, like Rich said, they'll never get out of level 2. And, you know, it may be background, it may be something else, and there's just nothing that can be done about it. So we definitely understand that, and, you know, we won't be pursuing enforcement action against you. So,
like I say, when it comes to numeric action levels, NELs, if you have an NEL exceedance, you're not out of compliance with the general permit. You're out of compliance if you don't follow up and take care of it. So if you find a problem and you fix it, or as we're talking about, you try to fix it to the best of your ability, you're not out of compliance. I have clients where they have a $100,000 a year treatment system. It's homemade, unfortunately, but it works really well. They just can't get copper down because copper is, 0.0332 milligrams per liter. It's really, really low. You can virtually get that from the air. And so they've done everything clean except for copper. And the permit allows you to say, look, we've done everything we can do. This is it. Anymore, we will go out of business. And so you're allowed, that's it. Basically, that's an avenue you could take. You're stuck at level 2, but then you've proven that you really have done everything you can do. Other clients, like I said, they have ponds and they don't discharge that much. Or or there's different reasons, or like natural background. Natural background is really hard to prove because it says you have to be solely attributed to the natural background. But we have one that proved that an inactive area had the same approximate numbers of an active area in terms of iron and aluminum. So look, same thing. They're not doing anything for 2 years here, and yet they have the same numbers. It has to be natural background. And so there are avenues you can take to keep you in compliance. So, wow, we're already at an hour, gentlemen. I really, really, truly appreciate allowing me to be able to join us today, and I greatly appreciate your time. As a recap, I think I'd like to say what to expect when you're inspecting. One, they're going to come in, and as we've learned, they're looking for generalized things. Good housekeeping. Everything's how's your stormwater pollution prevention plan, your SWAW, how's your paperwork. But also they're going to take a look at each site, and every site is not a cookie cutter. There's going to be unique things. So you may find that what they find in one site, like you're talking about, batch plants, may be different from a recycling facility or from a place that cuts a lot of wood. So bottom line is, from what I'm gathering, maybe you guys can help me out here. Good housekeeping seems to be one of the key things to do in terms of an inspection. And 2, make sure your paperwork's in order. Would that be good wrap-ups for what we're talking here today?
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely, like Rich was mentioning earlier, if they have really poor housekeeping practices and the site is a mess, we're probably going to drill down a little bit harder on our inspection, and we're probably going to end up finding some more bad things. So good housekeeping, you come to a site that's really clean, they're doing their sweeping, the sites around the storm drains are clean, they have the appropriate BMPs. We're not going to spend a lot of time really looking for other issues. So that's a big one. And yeah, the paperwork is also a big one. A lot of times they don't have monthly inspection reports on site. They don't have their stormwater training, annual site evaluations, things like that. And we definitely, on that, we're pretty flexible. If they don't have them on site, we'll just ask for them to send them on. If they don't have them, that's another issue. Then that's a violation of the permit. But yeah, keeping the paperwork up. I mean, that's a requirement. That all that paperwork, including an updated SWIP and site map, are kept on site for 5 years. So that is another aspect to our inspection. And a lot of times we'll do that either prior to or after the inspection. So when we're on site, we can focus on what's at the facility.
So, gentlemen, do you have any final thoughts before we close this out for the day?
No, just we appreciate being here and talking about stormwater, and it's certainly something that we're passionate about. We both do it. And so all of our inspectors really want to work with folks and try and resolve any issues they have, help them understand the permit. And we're kind of in this thing together. And in the end, as I said earlier, a couple times, I think today, it's really all about water quality in the end.
Well, I really appreciate you gentlemen joining us today. I think it really helps give some folks some insight into what you're looking for, helps them understand that this is a partnership. and do the best you can. And I've seen it that when you get inspected, if you try to carry through and follow through on what you're asked, things usually go well. So thank you again, gentlemen, for your time today. I much appreciate it for your time and your ability to be here today.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll send on a copy of a couple of SWIPs that you can distribute to anyone who's interested.
Fantastic. And if you are interested in a copy of that SWIP, then go ahead and email us at coordinator@stormwaterawareness.org. We will be sure to get that to you. So thank you for attending today. Be sure you check out the rest of the workshops that are happening this week. We have a great lineup. You can find out all the details on our website, which is stormwaterawareness.org. But thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.